Hello, I'm Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and this week's contract tip has to do with the RE forms and a seller's right to terminate based on something going on with the buyer's financing. So in the RE forms contract, the buyer's right to terminate contingency and the financing contingency and the appraisal contingency are all included in the actual purchase and sale of the RE forms. No additional exhibits need to be attached unless it's FHA or VA, and then those exhibits absolutely need to be attached. But in the RE forms, the actual financing contingency there aren't any separate exhibits that have to go with it. The only thing in the RE forms exhibit that as an agent you should attach are the standard terms. Now in the purchase and sale itself of the RE forms, it states big bold paragraph before any of the parties sign, before any of the parties even discuss the terms, it states that the standard terms are included as part of the contract, and it puts the onus onto the buyer and the seller to go to the website referenced in that document to look and read those standard terms. If you're a Maximum One agent, it is absolutely our policy that if you go binding on the RE forms contract, you absolutely must print out the standard terms, reference them as an exhibit in your contract, and attach them. I highly encourage anybody watching this video, if you go binding under the RE forms contract, to do the same. That's where the consideration is of the contract. That's where the promises are contained between the buyer and the seller, and that's where the time frames, the consequences, so forth and so on. So that is where the information that I am talking about in today's video happens to be included. It is under the standard terms, and it is paragraph 6.3.2, discussing the financing contingency of the buyer. And basically what it says is if an underwriter's guidelines result in an increase in costs or expenses to the seller or affect the date of closing, then the seller, at the seller's sole discretion, shall have the right to unilaterally terminate the contract within 3 days of receipt of that notice, thereby releasing the buyer and the seller from any further obligations or responsibilities to the other. If the seller does not terminate the contract, the seller is deemed to consent to those changes that are mandated by the underwriting guidelines. So in the RE forms contract, there's no unilateral right to extend closing. However, there are times when a buyer's lender, for whatever reason, can't get the loan done and can't get everything processed through underwriting in time for closing. So the burden is on the buyer to send a notice to the seller saying, okay, seller, that's key. The buyer has got to send the notice. So the buyer sends the notice to the seller saying, okay, seller, based on the lender's guidelines, we cannot close at the contracted closing date. At that point, the seller has 3 days to agree and then just go on, or say, no, I'm going to terminate, and terminate the contract. If the seller does not terminate into that time frame, then the seller is deemed to consent to those changes, including the delay in closing. So just a quick contract tip. That's a part that isn't discussed that much in classes. And again, the GAR contract does have that unilateral right to extend contract. The RE forms has no unilateral right. But again, sometimes lenders aren't able to get the loan closed per the contracted closing date, so make sure you pay attention to that clause in the contract. Thank you so much for watching. Again, I'm Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.